To set up the game, place the event board near the main board. The rulebook says to place the event board above the main board, but due to the fact that I have little space on this table, I'm just going to set it down here. Take the Leopold the Vast cadaver card and set it aside for now. Shuffle and sort all of the cadaver cards by their types: public square, hospital, morgue, and cemetery. Take the morgue deck and place it face up on the morgue space. Take the cemetery deck and place it face down on the cemetery space. The public square and hospital decks can be simply placed face down off to the side. Draw a number of hospital cards equal to the number of players and then simply place them on a face-up stack at the hospital space. Shuffle the scoundrel cards, then deal 3 scoundrel cards face up in the 3 spaces at the dock space. The remaining scoundrel cards can be put in a face-down stack nearby. Shuffle the research deck, then deal 2 cards face up into the 2 spaces of the academy, and then place the rest of it in a face-down stack nearby. Shuffle the humanity cards and deal 2 to the face-up spaces of St. Roch, and then take the rest of these and place them in a face-down stack nearby. Take 6 event cards and 4 encounter cards and shuffle them together to form the event deck. Then draw 2 more random event cards and place them on top of the event deck. Then cover the event deck with the event cover and then place the event deck on the appropriate space of the event board. The reason why you need to cover it is because the event cards and the encounter cards are double-sided and they have different triggers depending on what round of the game that you're actually in. When you place the event deck on the event board, make sure the event tokens are placed nearby. Set the blue captain marker on the first space of the story track. Place the appropriate bribe and bump track and place it in the bribe and bump space depending on the number of players. I'll be setting up for a 4-player game, so we'll just be using the one that's printed on the board. Shuffle this stack of bonus objective tiles and then deal 4 of them onto the bonus objectives track of the board. The remaining 2 bonus tokens can be put back in the box as they will not be used for this game. Make sure all of the materials, tokens, coins, body parts, and dice are all placed in their appropriate stacks nearby. Just to clarify, you're technically supposed to separate the materials by their color, but again, I don't have much space on this table, so I just put them all together. Give each player a laboratory board and make sure the 3 dials on the board are set to their starting locations, which you can tell as they have their number surrounded by a diamond. 1 for expertise and reputation, and 0 for humanity. Deal each player a random character card. The character cards give you special abilities that you'll have throughout the game, and some of them will even give you a starting bonus at the beginning of the game. One thing to note though is that if you are playing this game for the first time and you're playing a 2-player game, it is highly recommended that you do not play with Prisha Chatwal and Baptiste Rousseau. Give each player an anatomy card which shows you the materials that you'll need, the intelligence that you need, and all the points that you'll score for either starting a body part on one side or completing a body part on the other side. I'll talk about the anatomy cards in more detail later on. Also, give each player one of these double-sided reference cards. Give each player a number of francs depending on how many players are in the game. Since I'm setting up for a 4-player game, each player will get 4 francs. Have each player take one of their large scientist meeples as well as 2 of their smaller assistant meeples and place them on their character card. All of the remaining meeples that the players have can be set aside for now. Each player places their score markers on the 0 space of the score track. And finally, randomly determine the first player and give them the first player creature marker. Once you've done everything that I've previously stated, you are ready to begin. The game takes place over a maximum of 12 rounds, and each round is divided into 4 phases that must be carried out in the following order: the event phase, the city phase, the lab phase, and then the reset phase. In the event phase, the starting player will draw the top card off of the event deck, and then they will proceed to resolve it. There are two types of cards that can be drawn from the event deck: event cards and encounter cards. If you were to draw an event card, the first player will read the event card out loud to everyone and then put it in play. A lot of the event cards have some immediate effects and will often change the rules of the game for that round. For example, this one says, "The market, the cemetery, and lecturing at the academy are all off limits." If you want to, you can place these event markers at the affected locations to remind everybody where the effects of the events are taking place. The encounter cards are meant to represent the creature himself coming out to meet with the players. Each of these encounter cards will have a trigger word that will indicate when they will happen. If the trigger word is now, then that means that this encounter happens immediately. You will then look at the target for it and determine who is the target for this encounter. For example, this says all players, so this encounter card will target everybody. The first player will then read the card out to completion and follow any instructions that are listed on the encounter card. Some of these encounter cards, like this one here, will have the players need to read what's known as an entry. If a card requires a player to read an entry, like this one says, "If player received 2 francs, go to entry A5. Otherwise, go to entry B5. The card is referring to the encounter entries section starting on page 10 of the rulebook. You will then read through that entry and follow all the instructions on that as well. Some of the encounters, like this one here, features what's known as a location trigger. If the card that is drawn is an encounter card with a location trigger, then the first player will then keep it secret. If any player other than the first player, as they are the ones who drew the encounter card, goes to the location that is listed on the encounter, the first player will then pause the game and read out that there is an encounter. They will then read this encounter card as well as any entries listed on the encounter card if they are needed. Make sure you resolve this encounter before the player who went to the trigger location resolves that location in any way. After reading all of the encounter card and entries that are included with it, then the player who went to the location can resolve it if normal. One thing to keep in mind is that location encounters are held onto for the duration of the game and can only be discarded after being triggered. One thing to note is that if the card holder forgets to announce the encounter during the trigger, then the encounter card must be discarded without resolving it. If the target of the encounter says first player chooses, then that means that the first player can choose any player, including himself, to be the subject of the encounter. If the first player, however, is the target of the encounter, like this one is here, then you must have somebody else read the card to you. There are 2 other event effects that can show up during the event phase, and they're marked with these icons shown over here. If an event card comes up that has this guillotine icon, then that means there's been an execution. Take a number of cadaver cards from the public square deck and then place them face up into the associated spaces of the public square, depending on how many players are in the game. If an event card comes up that has the storm icon on it, players get to charge their Leyden jars. These are what you're going to need in order to try to shock your creature to life. If an event card comes up that has the storm icon on it, then that means all the players will then charge their Leyden jars to their maximum for free. One thing to note is that if during a round where there is a storm, a player manages to purchase a Leyden jar, then that means they get to immediately place that jar into their lab already charged. Once the card from the event deck has been resolved, the players will then move into the second phase, the city phase. Starting with the first player and going around, players will be taking turns placing their scientists and their assistants at various locations around Paris, as well as in their own labs, and taking the associated actions with each location. On your turn, you must either place one of your assistants or one of your scientists in one of the various locations on the main board in Paris or in your own lab. If you have no workers remaining, or if there's no valid spaces, then you must pass on your turn. Now before I actually go into detail about what all the various places do, there's a couple restrictions that I need to talk about with regard to the places. Many locations show this symbol, a tall black meeple with a small white meeple. This means that either the scientist, being the tall one, or an assistant can occupy this space. However, there are some locations that only show this tall black meeple representing the scientist. This means that the only type of worker that can go to spaces with this symbol is the scientist. Another restriction is that there are places like this one that will actually show a cost written underneath the space. In order to use this location, you must pay the cost written under that space. For example, in order to go to the morgue, you must pay 1 franc. To make it easier to remember, know that the cost to go to a location, if there is any, will always be printed below the space, and the benefit of the location will always be written above the space. There's one other restriction revolving around placing workers, and that revolves around this bribe and bump space. Here's a quick example of how the bribe and bump space works. Normally, in a worker placement game, once a location has been claimed, nobody else can go there for the rest of the round. However, the bribe and bump space allows a player to actually bump another player's worker off of that space and be able to take that space for themselves. To do this, simply just take your worker and move it into the space where another player's worker has been played. The player whose meeple just got bumped off will then take that meeple and place it in the first open space of the bribe and bump track. The player who has had their worker bumped off is referred to as the bumpy, and the player who bumped their worker off is referred to as the bumper, and so the bumper must pay the bumpy whatever amount of francs is listed in the space that they've occupied. For example, the green player, since they bumped the blue player off, they must pay them 1 franc. As soon as the bribe and bump spaces have been filled up, no other players can bump each other's workers off for the rest of the round. For example, I would not be able to take my worker and bump red off of the dock space because this bribe and bump track has already been filled up. One thing to note though is that you are allowed to bump your own workers off of the various spots for free as long as there is an open space for it. Now that we understand all the various restrictions that can occur when it comes to placing workers, now we'll go on to what the various locations do, starting with the cemetery. Whenever you place a worker at the cemetery, you will then draw the top 3 cards from the cemetery and choose any number of them to resolve. There are 4 bits of information that you need to know when it comes to cadavers. The cost is written in the upper left corner if there is any, as some of them do not. The second is that you have an option of what you do with the cadaver if you choose to resolve it. The third is this bar down here showing all the different types of materials that you can gain from the cadavers and how many of each type. And then the fourth is this little Roman numeral symbol down in the bottom left corner to show what type of stage of decomposition that they are in. For example, cadavers in the cemetery will always be either in the 3rd or 4th stage of decomposition, or will be a simple skeleton and will just be given bones, which have no stage. In addition, you don't have to choose any of these if you don't want to. If you choose to resolve some, for example, let's say I want to resolve this one. If there is a cost to resolve that cadaver, then I will pay that cost. In this case, there is not. And then I will choose one of 2 options that are on this cadaver. You can either choose to gain expertise in the subject, which is signaled by the brain, equal to what is shown on the brain, in this case 1 expertise, or you can choose to gain the materials from the cadaver, which is shown on the bottom bar. For each brain that is on the cadavers that you've chosen to resolve, you will increase your expertise dial by 1 for each brain. If, for example, I had chosen to resolve both of these instead, then I chose to gain the expertise, I would be gaining 2 expertise because each of these cards has 1 brain, thus increasing my expertise dial by 2 instead of 1. If I chose to gain the material on the cadaver like I did here, I will then gain the material listed in the bottom bar of the cadaver. In this case, that would be 3 organs and 3 bones. You will then place any bones that you've collected in the bones section of your lab, and any materials that you get will be placed in the appropriate stage of decomposition where the cadaver that you resolved was placed. For example, this cadaver is in the 4th stage of decomposition, and since I got the organs from this cadaver, I will be placing the organs in the 4th stage. After resolving all of the cadavers that you wanted to resolve, all 3 of these cadavers, whether they were resolved or not, will then be placed back underneath the cemetery cadaver deck. Another place to get cadavers is the public square. One thing to note though is that it is only possible to get cadavers at the public square if there was an event for the round that involved an execution. If there have been no executions this round, then nobody can go to the public square. If there were executions here, then a player can go to the public square by paying 1 franc. If you do this, you will then choose one of the cadavers that are available, and once again, just like with the cemetery, you will have one of 2 options. You could either gain the expertise on the cadaver, in this case it would be 2 expertise, or you could gain the material on the cadaver. In the case of this one, it would be 2 muscle, 3 organs, 2 blood, and 3 bones. Once again, if you pick the material, you'll gather all those materials and then place them in the appropriate decomposition spot on your lab board. And if you chose expertise, you'll gain the amount that is showing next to the brain. Regardless, after you've resolved a cadaver at the public square, you will take that cadaver and put it face down on the bottom of the public square deck and do not replace them. The next location is the hospital. There's 3 different things you can do at the hospital, and we're going to start with the top one here. So going to the top one will allow you to take cadavers based on your reputation. If you have 1 to 6 reputation, you don't take any. If you have 7 to 14, you can take the top one. And if you have 15 or more, you can take the top one. And you have the option, if you want, to pay 1 franc to be able to take the next top one. You will then resolve the cadavers that you've gained, once again, by either gaining expertise or getting the materials, and then you will return them to the bottom of the hospital cadaver deck. You will not replace the ones that are at the hospital. That is done during the reset phase. The next spot at the hospital is the work spot. Only the scientist can go here. If you do go here, you can gain a number of francs equal to your expertise. If you have 1 to 6 expertise, you will gain 2 francs. 7 to 12 will get you 3, and 13 or more will get you 4. The final spot is to volunteer. Once again, only the scientist can volunteer, but if you go there, you will gain a humanity and 2 reputation. Next up is the morgue. To go to the morgue, you are going to have to spend a franc in order to go there. When you go to the morgue, you will then draw the top 2 cadavers of the morgue, and then you can choose to resolve either of them, both of them, or none of them, just like in the other locations. Just like the others, if you choose to resolve a cadaver at the morgue, you will pay the cost listed in the top left, if there is one, and then choose whether to gain the expertise or the materials from the cadavers that you have chosen. As a reminder, you can choose to resolve any number of them or none of them at all if you don't want to. Once you have resolved the cadavers, place them back on the bottom of the morgue's cadaver deck. Next up is the academy, where there are 4 places that you can go to. The top 2 are research. When you go to one of these researches, you will then choose one of these 2 research cards and take them, placing them in front of you. You will then replace that taken card with a new research card from the deck. The other one is advanced research. Only the scientist can do advanced research, but if you go here, it acts the same way as doing normal research, except advanced research will allow you to increase your expertise by 1. Giving a lecture can be occupied by either the scientist or an assistant, but gives a different bonus depending on who goes there. If you occupy the lecture with an assistant, you will gain 1 franc and 1 reputation. If you occupy it with a scientist, you gain a franc and 2 reputation. Finally, there's the donate spot. The donate allows you to trade 1 to 3 francs for 1 to 3 reputation at a 1-to-1 rate. The slaughterhouse allows you to get animal parts to substitute for parts that you need. If you go to the slaughterhouse, you can either choose to get 3 animal parts at stage 1 or 4 animal parts at stage 2. St. Roch functions similar to the Academy, but this focuses more on humanity. If you were to go there with your assistant, you get to choose one of these humanity cards and take it, placing it in front of you, replacing the taken card with a new one from the top of the deck. If you occupy St. Roch with a scientist, in addition to gaining one of the cards, you also gain a humanity. I'll talk more about the research cards and humanity cards later on. Going to the market allows you to sell goods that you kept and buy goods for things that you need. If you go here, you could do any number of what's shown in the market square as many times as you want. You can sell 2 bones to get a franc, 3 organs and or muscle in any combination for 2 francs, spend 2 francs to get a Leyden jar, or spend 1 franc to get a block of ice. I'll explain what the block of ice does during the reset phase. Next is the first player space. If you go to the first player space, you'll obviously get the first player marker, but there's another benefit to going here. After all the players have placed their workers, you then, if you placed in the first player space, will then get to take your worker and place it in any open legal space, and even bump players off if it's legal to do so, and then resolve the effect of the new place where you placed your worker. Next is the docks. When you place a worker at the docks, you can then choose to take one of these scoundrel cards and gain its benefit. Simply choose one of the scoundrel cards that are out here, pay the cost that is in the upper left corner, and then resolve the effect of the scoundrel card. If the scoundrel provides a text effect, simply just do whatever that says and then discard it. If the scoundrel has options on it, like this one does, you can then choose one of the 3 options to resolve. Regardless of which scoundrel you picked, you will then take that scoundrel and then discard it face down to the bottom of the docks deck. Then replace that scoundrel with a new one from the top of the deck immediately. The last place you can go to in Paris is the Dark Alley. You can only send your scientist to the Dark Alley, and that's because if you go here, you are going to commit a murder. You will gain all the materials listed in the space to where the appropriate location is. In this case, it's 4 muscle, 4 organs, 3 blood, and 2 bones into the first stage spot. However, you will also lose 3 humanity, and you must get one of these police markers and place it on your character. If your character ever has 2 police markers, you can no longer go to the Dark Alley. However, you can spend 3 francs at any time to clear the police markers off of your character. Now we'll move on to the places that you can go to on your lab boards. And these are places that everybody can go because everybody will have these on their lab boards. The first one is practice, where only the scientists can go, and if you go there, you will increase your expertise by 1. If you go to give blood, you will simply gain 3 blood tokens and place them in the first stage of the decomposition track. If you go to the repair spot, then you get to repair up to 3 damage tokens by removing them from up to 3 body parts that are on your table. I'll explain how body parts get damaged later on. Finally, if you go to the charge Leyden jars, you can charge either 2 Leyden jars that are on your table if you sent your assistant there, or 3 Leyden jars if you sent your scientist there. After all of the players have placed all of their workers, the game moves into the third phase of the round, which is the lab phase. During the lab phase, all players will simultaneously perform the 3 following actions in order: building monster parts, throwing the switch, and preserving materials. To build a body part, first look at your anatomy card and decide which body part that you want to create. You can make as many body parts as you want to or are able to, with a few restrictions. You can only make at most 1 head, a torso, 2 arms, and 2 legs. Every time you want to build a monster part that you don't have, you first need to build the muscle portion, which to do that, you will look at the Start a Monster Part side. So then, you will look at which body part that you want to build, and then check to see if you have the minimum required expertise in order to build that part. Let's say, for example, I want to build an arm. Well, the minimum required expertise to build an arm or start an arm is 3. And my expertise level is 3, so I could build an arm this round. To do this, you will then discard the amount of materials listed for that body part. And you can do that from anywhere on the decomposition track that you want. For example, if in this case I want to build the arm, then I would need to discard 3 muscles, 2 organs, and 3 bones. So I will discard 3 muscles and 2 organs from the second decomposition spot, and 3 bones from the bone supply, and bring them all back to the supply. You will then place that body part in the appropriate space of your lab with the muscle side up, since you are starting the body part. Whenever you do discard your materials, do remember where the stages of decomposition you took them from, as that will become important for when you score the body part. One thing to note on a future round, if you want to try to add skin to the body part, which is on the other side of the body part tiles, you will need to consult the other side of the anatomy card of the complete a monster part. One thing to note though is that if you have animal parts in your decomposition track, you can actually use these to substitute for just about any other parts that you need in order to build a body part. You can substitute them for organs, bones, and muscles. The only restriction when it comes to using animal parts to build body parts is that animal parts in stages 3 and 4 of decomposition cannot be used to substitute for blood. Ones that are in stages 1 and 2 can still be used as blood. After you've built your body part, you will then check the anatomy chart and go to the victory points chart, and then determine where was the latest stage that you used your materials to build the part. Regardless of how many of them that you built, you will earn points for your body part equal to the latest stage of decomposition that you used a material on. Now in this example, I had used all of my materials from stage 2, so that would mean that for this arm I would gain 4 points. However, if I had, instead of using one of my organs from stage 2, used stage 4 to build the arm, then that would mean that I would only be gaining 2 points for the arm, since 4 was the latest stage that I had used a material to build the body part. It does not matter how many materials from each stage that you've used. All that matters is what was the latest stage where you used a material to build the body part. One other thing to note is that if you used an animal part at all to build a body part, you will get the points for building the body part, but you will lose whatever points shown on this grid for using the animal part. One thing to note though is that it does not matter how many animal parts you used to build that part, you will only lose whatever is listed in this column. For example, if I had 8 animal parts sitting in stage 1 and I used all 8 of them to build the arm, I would gain the 4 points because that is the latest stage of decomposition that I used materials to build, but I would only lose 1 point since I used animal parts. Also, after every single time you build a new body part or upgrade a body part, you will always gain 1 expertise for that part. For example, if in this lab phase I had managed to build this arm on the muscle side and this leg on the muscle side, I would gain 2 expertise. One thing to note is that if you were to build a body part that if later on in the game gets downgraded or destroyed, you do not lose the expertise or the points that you gained for that part, and you can gain expertise and points again if you build it again. After all the players have completed building their monster parts, you then move into the second step, which is throwing the switch. If you have at least 1 complete monster part on your operating table, meaning a part that has its skin side showing, then you have 1 free opportunity to throw the switch to try to bring that monster part to life. To do this, flip either 1, 2, or 3 of your linden jars from its charged side to its uncharged side. You will then roll 2 shock dice for each of the linden jars that you flipped over. At this point in time, if you had any research cards that had an effect that allow you to mitigate the dice, like this one does here, as it's showing dice on the bottom, then you could use that now. Next, resolve all of the damage symbols, that being this lightning bolt that you've rolled, by placing a damage token on 1 or more body parts that are on the table for each lightning bolt that you've rolled. For each one that you've placed, that body part has now taken damage. Each body part can only have 1 damage marker on that part. If a body part were to ever receive a second damage marker, you will then either take all the damage markers off of that part and then flip it back over to its muscle side if it was a completed part, or if a muscle part got 2 damage markers, you will take all of the damage markers in the part and remove them from the board. If a body part that had an alive token on it were to receive a second damage token, simply remove the damage tokens and the alive marker from the part. One thing to know about placing damage is that you cannot place a second damage marker on a part until all other parts have 1 damage on it already. In this example, however, I did not roll any damage symbols, so I'll take all these off. Next, if you manage to roll 1 of these hearts, you will lose 1 humanity. You will only lose 1 humanity regardless of how many hearts you've rolled. Finally, for each of these alive symbols that you've rolled, place 1 of these alive tokens on each completed body part if you are able to. That body part is now considered alive. One thing to note is that a body part cannot have more than 1 alive token on it, and if you do not have the parts to place all of the alive tokens, then any leftover alive tokens are wasted. Finally comes the third step for the lab phase, and that is to preserve materials. At this moment, every player can, if they want to, take any number of organs or muscles that are on their tracks and place them into this reserve space. For example, I want to save these 2 organs to try to sell them at the market in the next round, so I'll simply take those organs and place them into the reserve space. Once a material has been placed into the reserve space, you cannot use these materials to build body parts anymore. You will be able to sell the organs and muscles in a future round by putting them to the market. After everyone is done with preserving their materials, we then move into the 4th phase of the round, the reset phase. When the reset phase happens, 4 things will happen in the following order. First, you must decompose materials. This is where the ice cubes that you can get at the market will come into play. Whenever you buy an ice cube from the market, you will immediately place it into this ice space. In the decomposition phase, all the players must decompose the materials that they have gathered. If a player has an ice block in their possession, then they will flip that ice block over to its half melted side and they will not move any materials at all. If a player has a half melted ice block, they will remove the ice block from their board and not move any materials. Each player that does not have an ice block will then move each of their materials one step closer to decomposing to nothing on the decomposition track. For example, this organ will decomposition down to stage 3 since I do not have an ice block, and this blood will decompose to nothing because blood does not last beyond stage 2. As you can see here, it reads discard blood. Next, you will discard and replenish all of the cards at the docks, St. Roch, the academy, and at the hospital. One thing to remember is that the hospital is always replenished with a stack of face-up cards equal to the number of players. Also, if there had been any leftover execution cards at the public square, discard those to the bottom of the public square deck and do not replace them. Then discard any event cards that are in play as well as any corresponding event markers. Collect all the meeples on the board and return them to their owner's character cards. Finally, move the captain marker forward one space on the story track. Once those 4 steps have been completed, the reset phase is over and you are ready for the next round, starting with the event phase and then going to the city phase and so on. Now before I go and talk about the game ends and the final scoring, there are a few loose ends that I do want to talk about, starting with the bonus objectives. Every game is going to have 4 bonus objectives that are going to be available, and each of these bonus objectives has a special condition on them that if the player manages to achieve it, they will take that token to score 10 bonus points at the end of the game. Most of these bonuses are being the first player to achieve something, like this is being the first to achieve 23 on the reputation dial, first to 10 on the humanity dial, first to have 2 alive body parts, first to 27 on the expertise dial, along with first to have 6 monster parts on the table. The only bonus objective that does not require you to be the first to achieve it is this one here, to have the most franks at the end of the game. The next thing I want to talk about are these dials. These dials have some bonuses that can be listed on each of these dials that I wanted to go over real quick. As you progress through the game, you will gain and lose stats on your reputation, expertise, and humanity. And depending on how high or low you go, you can get certain bonuses and penalties depending on which dial you're at. Each of these dials has point bonuses at certain points on the dials. For example, if you were to get your reputation dial to 9, then you would get 5 bonus points at the end of the game. And if you manage to get your expertise dial to 11, you'll get 10 bonus points. If your humanity dial were to be at -2 by the end of the game, you will lose 5 points. There's also some bonuses that you can get for yourself that you can use for the duration of the game if you manage to get there. At 2 different spots, 14 and 20 on the expertise die, if you manage to get to those points, then every time you go to throw the switch, you can substitute one of the gray shock dice for the blue shock dice, which are much more favorable. Keep in mind, anytime you drop below the value of one of the blue dice, you will lose access to that blue die and go back to the gray. The reputation dial is an opportunity for you to gain more workers and upgrade your workers. If you manage to get your reputation die to 7, you will gain a new assistant. If you manage to get your reputation dial up to 11, then you can swap an assistant out of the game and replace him with a scientist. The same thing goes if you get your reputation dial to 16 and 20. However, anytime you fall below the key markers for each of the upgrades, then you must downgrade your worker in such a manner. For example, if I was at 20 and I fell down to 19, then I have to swap my scientist back to an assistant. The last one is the humanity. The humanity kind of coincides with the reputation, as the higher you get, the more reputation you can earn. If you get to 3, 5, 7, and 9 on your humanity track, then for each one of those that you reach, you will gain a reputation. But every time you get to -3, 5, and 7, you will lose a reputation. If your humanity ever drops to -9, then you have to give up an assistant until you gain it back up. And if your humanity ever gets to this lock icon, then your humanity is locked there and you cannot gain or lose humanity whenever an action would normally allow you to do so. Meaning your humanity is now stuck at the worst it could get and you are guaranteed to lose 20 points at the end of the game. The last thing I need to talk about is the research cards and humanity cards. These cards give various effects and bonuses to the players. You can have at the most 3 of each of these cards. If you ever want to draw a 4th research or humanity card, which is always optional, you must first discard one of the cards that you already have back to the bottom of its corresponding deck. Most of these cards specify when they can be used, and using them is always optional. If you choose to use them, they will offer you a one-time effect which is listed in the text of the card and may grant dial bonuses for you, after which the card is discarded. For example, this one says take and discard up to 3 materials of different colors from another player's lab and gain 2 humanity. Alternatively, research cards can be played after rolling shock dice to gain the dice mitigation effect listed after the die icon on the card. If additional rerolls are desired, then additional research cards can be played for this purpose. One last thing to talk about is the attributes. There will be times throughout the game, whether it's through utilizing a location or paying to use a cadaver, or paying to use one of the scoundrels at the docks, or some other effect that will cause a player to gain or lose attributes. Whenever you have to increase or decrease an attribute, then you will turn the corresponding dial that many spaces in the appropriate direction. The game will end in one of 2 ways. Either the captain gets to the end of the story track, or if by the end of the lab phase, 1 or more players have brought all 6 of their body parts to life. Whenever the game ends, you will gain bonus points in the 5 following ways. First, you will gain bonus points for each body part that you have that is alive at the end of the game. For example, if the head is alive, I will get a bonus of 14. You will earn 10 points for each bonus tile that you've collected. You will gain points according to the highest space that you have reached on your expertise and reputation dial. You will gain or lose points based on the highest or lowest position that you've reached on your humanity dial. And lastly, if the game ends by having the captain reach the end of the story track, then the player with the highest positive humanity gets 5 bonus points. And if 2 more players are tied, each of them gets 5 points each. Count up your total points, and whoever has the most points is the winner. In the case of a tie, the player with the most alive body parts wins. If there's still a tie, the player who has the most Franks wins, and if there's still a tie, then the player who is most recent after the first player wins. And that's everything you need to know in order to play Abomination the Heir of Frankenstein. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a big thumbs up. If you want to know my thoughts on Abomination the Heir of Frankenstein, or if you want more videos, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more tutorials, reviews, and unboxings. Thank you all as always so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.